Hello, everyone. My name is Camille Cameron. I'm pleased to be the moderator for this session, title of which is Ocean and Climate. I'll introduce our speakers and then we'll carry on. First, I'll introduce Loveth Ovedje. Loveth is a PhD candidate at the Schulich School of Law. She specializes in climate finance law. Her research explores transformative climate finance mechanisms for accelerating renewable energy deployment in developing countries. And Loveth is part of the Open Think program at Dell. Next, we have Dr. Patrícia Galvão Ferreira. Patrícia is an associate professor with the Marine and Environmental Law Institute here at Schulich. Her research and teaching are informed by her previous 20-year work in non-governmental organizations in the areas of human rights and economic justice, with a focus in Latin America, especially Brazil, and Southern Africa. And last and certainly not least, Professor Constance MacIntosh. Constance researches and teaches in the areas of immigration and refugee law, and also in health policy, especially as it impacts on individuals and population groups and communities who may fall into jurisdictional gaps or disputes. She was the director of Dalhousie's Health Law Institute, acting director for the McEachern Institute for Public Policy and Governance, and domain leader with the Atlantic Metropolitan Project. And I'll turn it over now to the panel.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our discussion today, and thank you to MELAW for the opportunity to share my initial thoughts on the issue of the finance gap in marine resilience in least developed countries and small island developing states. So as an overview of what I intend to do within the 10-15 minutes I've been given today is to give a background as to how I developed my thoughts around the climate finance gap in marine resilience, the Ocean Risks and Resilience Action Alliance, and then I also draw some reflections. So as a bit of background, after COP29 and the mixed reaction from the agreed NCQG, given the economic report as to the need for 1.3 trillion for the developing countries to be able to mitigate climate change in 2030, I started thinking around how countries should start thinking about alternative sources for finance, seeing we've been relying on government promises for a long time that has not beared much fruit. That's one of my thoughts around innovative climate financing. Then the next was when I stumbled on this Guardian article from an oceanographer and professor at Murdoch University, Jennifer, who was sharing her reflective thoughts after their return from Antarctica as to how our oceans are very much interconnected, and the issue of pollution and climate change affects all the oceans across the world. So that's another area that made me think about how climate finance is there, and then the need to also direct some of that finance to building marine resilience among these countries while we start to put our thoughts together and strategy towards providing the finance that is really needed by the developing countries. So what is climate finance? It is the local, national or transnational financing drawn from public, private, or alternative sources of financing towards supporting climate mitigation, adaptation efforts around the world and to address climate change. So those finance has been put within the organization of the GEF and the GCF. They've also been funds allocated to least developed countries to mitigate and also for adaptation. However, less than 2% of this climate finance is targeted towards ocean resilience, whereas there are over 680 million people living in low-lying coastal areas, according to IPCC reports in 2023, because climate finance focuses heavily on terrestrial mitigation and adaptation, whereas marine ecosystems remain underfunded despite their critical role. So the coral reefs, the mangroves are not only carbon sinks, they are also biodiversity hotspots, and they also help to build resilience for these communities, as well as source of food and source of living. So the key concerns is that the LDCs and seeds are disproportionately vulnerable, and while we are yet to get to that meeting point on how much finance is needed, these groups are suffering from the effects of climate change, and there is an urgent need to get finance that would aggravate their situation before we make some form of agreement. So this is what turned my attention to the ORRAA. It was founded in 2019, and it is a multi-stakeholder connector finance organization. So what it does is it uses innovative finance to gather finance from insurance companies, governments, private partners, as well as global south partners. The goal it has currently is to mobilize 500 million by 2030 for ocean climate resilience, and it's aimed at targeting 250 million people around the LDCs and the SIDS. So Canada is also one of its funding partners, and between 2020 to 2022, it had contributed the sum of 2.4 million. Although this amount is small, it just shows that there is some form of interest with ocean resilience efforts and financing from some government bodies. It also just focused on grant-based finance and then dealing with adaptation programming that has to do with gender-based integration, as the ORRAA had also concluded that there's a lot of females and women face more the impacts of climate change than other sets of people within those communities. So this fund wasn't, however, directed towards biodiversity or any of that effort, surprisingly. But either way, the ORAA's financial innovation is one of the things that I would like to highlight today, is its use of insurance products, resilience bonds, and blended finance models. So insurance products that it uses includes coral reef insurance, and it works by having people buy insurance products targeted at all these coastal communities to ensure that where there is any of those climate change impacts, those insurance companies will be able to provide some form of relief to those communities. So it makes use of some form of parametric insurance that would ensure that these communities get rapid payouts, unlike the usual insurance timelines, once there is a happening of a particular stated climate change effect. So for instance, the hurricanes, the flooding and other kind of effects from climate change happening around these coastal areas that have been stated in those insurance contracts are kind of what the organization seeks to provide. Another is the resilient bonds, which is a blend of public-private capital. So while governments might provide some form of bonds towards some of those LDCs and seeds, private partners could also invest in such bonds based on the returns that in some societies or communities, there would have been more positive outcomes from marine resilience efforts. So the last model of that blended finance can be seen in the Sea Change Impacts Financing Facility, and this is one of the blue finance framework that the ORRA is using to create some form of accelerated finance to coastal and ocean resilience, particularly in the global south. The ORRA, unlike what we find in the global finance architecture, prioritizes agenda-sensitive design. It has also shown that it prioritizes local knowledge and participation. It doesn't just go to these communities without engaging with stakeholders in understanding where the marine resilience or risk assessment should be targeted at. It also includes Global South countries in its partnership, even countries who are under development assistance. It just only recognizes their special circumstances in the fact that they might not be able to afford the funding obligations for being a member of this program. So as I've been saying so far, you can see that the strength, of course, of this program is its innovative financial instruments that has seemed to lower the barriers for private investors. Ocean has been underfunded for a while for some reasons that scholars have advanced, such as complexity. And this form of financial instrument helps to give private investors that confidence to be able to be part of ocean resilience projects, since it's an insurance-branded product and other form of instruments as well. It also thrives on multi-stakeholder engagement. It doesn't just rely on the public state parties. It has opened its doors to both private, NGOs, other form of engagement with different type of stakeholders. And this manages its risks, so it's not solely dependent on a particular party, like what we have now in the global finance architecture with the US stepping out and causing some form of funds restriction within the UN. That is not something that the ORRAA would face due to how it is multi-stakeholder arranged. It also seems to align with various international legal frameworks and the SDG 14. For instance, the Paris Agreement in Article 7 and 9 provides for these finance flows from developed to developing countries, as well as the Kunming-Montreal framework, which also talks about financing biodiversity efforts as well. So having some finance go to these seeds and LDCs to build their marine resilience shows that the program is working hand in hand with the international legal frameworks. However, it is not integrated into any core GCF or UNFCCC processes, and so it doesn't have that capacity to influence as much as it should. It's also voluntary and donor dependent, so no form of obligation that is legal and can be enforced. There's a scale mismatch. It is projecting $500 million to affect 250 million people, but given the recent data on the need for developing countries, it might seem that it doesn't just need millions, but billions. Also, reliance on some form of public finance might also be one of the things limiting this form of finance. So my initial reflections or recommendations from this would be to say if it's possible to embed marine ecosystems in NDCs and national adaptation plans. This is to make sure that we are not just inferring that there's some form of marine resilience financing within the current framework, but that it is explicitly stated. Also ensuring that we use some of this innovative financing like insurance that doesn't require that form of timeline, that is required from other form of financing that requires agreements, negotiations, and other kind of logistics. Also recognizing that ocean resilience in GCF and COP negotiations might be another way to go in ensuring that marine resilience is a topic that is highlighted and then mainstreaming marine systems into global finance law and policy. So today I leave you all with this word from Peter Thompson. He says you cannot have a healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and it is time that we, as law and policy, work with science to see that financing marine resilience in all these communities is moved forward to ensure a healthier planet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Loveth, for that interesting topic on climate finance. And of course, it's always a question in so many ways in life. How are we going to pay for this? Well, that's a really good introduction and discussion. Our next speaker is Patrícia Galvão Ferreira, Associate Professor. Patrícia is going to speak to us on From Dialogue to Mechanism, Evaluating Legal Options for Ocean Climate Action in the Paris Agreement. Over to you, Patrícia.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at the MELAW anniversary. It's really, for me, a great opportunity, has been a great opportunity to start a new research agenda on this intersection between climate, which has been my original research agenda, international climate law, transnational climate law, and climate justice, but now integrating oceans and climate. So what I'm going to share with you today is exactly this part of this new research agenda. So I changed a little bit to the title. So it's From Dialogue to Mechanism, the case for thick integration of ocean climate nexus under the Paris Agreement. And the oceans, as we all know, absorb 90% of excess heat and around 30% of CO2. So it's crucial to stabilize the climate, and marine ecosystems are very vulnerable to climate impacts. And yet, oceans remain only thinly integrated in the international climate regime. So in my 10 minutes, I would like to make a case that the Paris Agreement needs a permanent mechanism for the integration of oceans and climate, so we need a thicker integration of ocean and climate in the international climate regime. And I will also share this research agenda for which type of mechanism then we should have or we could have. So this image here reflects a core challenge. UNCLOS and the UNFCCC, they are both central to regulating ocean climate interactions, but they have evolved, of course, in parallel tracks that were not designed to meet, right? So one regulates marine pollution and protection, but lacks any climate mandate. The other one, regulates greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts, but historically, it has overlooked climate actions or any climate commitments. So the binary land versus seas that we were discussing yesterday is quite evident here. And this fragmentation that scholars call treaty siloing can limit our ability to effectively govern these cost-cutting issues like marine carbon dioxide removal, adaptation for planning for coastal ecosystems, dedicated and sustainable finance that Loveth was speaking about for ocean climate action. So we all know, of course, there is a need for integration, right? But the devil is always in the details. Yes, there is a need for integration, but how to get there? How do we promote this integration when these two legal systems have different histories? They operate under different mandates. They have very different institutional legacies, power dynamics, principles, etc. So take the climate, the integration of oceans in the climate regime as an example. You can see that it has been a very, very slow integration. So from in the beginning, 1992 until 2009, there was almost nothing. There was just a brief mention of oceans in Article 4.1d in the UNFCCC as greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs, but nothing more. It took long, long years. Only in COP15 in 2009, it was a bottom-up approach. It was not states that were trying to integrate these. Advocates, ocean advocates, those working on ocean issues, were the ones pushing for this integration. They started with advocating and organizing the first Ocean Action Day during COP, so this was a parallel session. It was not official. And they started organizing every year one Ocean Action Day. Then they got one big ally, which was one country. A party, Chile, decided to really push this agenda and sponsored because the Ocean Declaration. So this declaration was signed by 23 other countries. So we got many small island nations that for them, ocean and climate intersection was a priority to really back up these efforts by a group of countries, developing countries, to integrate oceans in the climate regime. But still, when we got to COP21, the one that where Paris was signed, it only added oceans as part of the preamble, so there was still no mechanism, no operative provision in the Paris Agreement that really included oceans. So there was no mention in climate finance, in adaptation, so again, it was a brief mention, but it was symbolic, and it opened the way for later greater integration. So in 2015, COP23, we had, by the initiative of another developing country, Fiji, a small island nation, the Ocean Pathway Initiative. So for the first time, they got enough critical mass for a mandate for the IPCC to do the report on oceans and cryosphere, which was essential to really raise the awareness about this intersection and the importance of integrating more thoroughly. So in 2019, Chile was the one presiding the COP. It happened in Madrid, but it was under the presidency of Chile, and that was considered the blue COP. So the IPCC report on oceans was released, and then there was the first ocean and climate dialogue via the subsidiary body on science. So you see that it started very slowly, this integration, but it's still very far from what we would expect when we think about the importance of oceans to the climate system. So what do we have now? Right now, since 2020, nothing very big has happened. So what we have had since that year are the dialogues. So each COP, it's not permanent, so it's temporary, it's ad hoc, and the states have to renew the mandate for these dialogues, but they are happening every year now. They are happening within this subsidiary body. It's very valuable for information sharing, but it's really non-binding. It does lack procedural consequences, so it's still really very soft, even for the standards of the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's a big discussion in the literature, right? Is this how it's supposed to be? Are most countries that are resisting further integration, of a thicker integration, right? Don Bodansky, which is a big name in international climate law and has followed the climate negotiations and has written extensively on institutional design of multilateral environmental agreements, he says that, yes, this is okay. He thinks that this should continue to be like it's happening now. There should be only a thin integration. He says that the climate regime should really focus, there should be a division of labor. The climate agreement should focus on reducing emissions. The best that the climate regime can do to protect the oceans is to get states to reduce emissions as much as possible. While the oceans regimes, they are the ones that should be focusing more on climate adaptation. And there should be just a little bit of coordination in this thin integration. However, my argument in this paper in progress is that the legal and political economy context has shifted. And I think there is now a big normative imperative to push for greater integration, a thicker integration. One factor is the advisory opinion by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Seas that said that greenhouse gas emissions are marine pollution for the effects of the convention, the Law of the Seas. So states have a due diligence duty or obligation to prevent and address impacts. So that legally is clear now that there is this obligation. There is also, we can see that the efforts, the ground up efforts by a few countries and other advocates, social advocates, to include this thin integration is getting results. So there is more openness to include ocean climate actions in NDCs and integrated this ocean and climate in all different work programs that exist under the Paris Climate Agreement. So there is more political willingness by a greater number of countries to accept this thicker integration. And then the reality on the ground. Many countries are now promoting or scaling up marine CDR. There is also a lot of emphasis on offshore renewable energy that can have a lot of impact on marine ecosystems as well. So we can see that the problems with this interaction are becoming more visible. Plus, there are also, from an adaptation point of view and an equity or justice point of view, coastal communities are facing significant impacts of climate change and climate action. And without integrating this more strongly in the climate regime, we leave those countries, again, to fight for action in another regime and not within the climate regime where the equity principles are stronger. So there is also a climate justice imperative to promote this thicker integration. So in the paper, I'm not going to go over the detail, my time is finished now, but what I'm looking then, after this normative imperative, talking about the change in the political economy circumstances, I'm looking at what then are the options, right? What are the specific options for this thicker integration? One potential option is the agriculture Coronivia work program. And then in the paper, I'm looking at the history of this work program and how it has been from the get-go more integrated when it was established than the dialogues, and try to understand why, and also comparing and seeing if there is any potential for this type of mechanism to be replicated in the ocean's climate nexus. So this raises the question then also of, if not this type of model, what other potential institutional mechanism could help this thicker integration? But this is a cliffhanger. I have not finished the paper. So when I do finish, I hope that some of you will read and see what will be the options. But the big challenge is going from the idea and the theory that we should promote more integration between those siloed regimes and actual realistic options, legal, political, policy, realistic options to promote this integration. But my argument to counter what Bodansky says about the thin integration, I don't think that oceans can wait until COP50 for these two regimes to develop and separate. Dialogues have opened the door within the international climate regime, but it's past the time to step through this open door and really promote this thicker integration as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrícia. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Constance MacIntosh, and Constance's title is Forced Migration at Sea, State and Shipmaster Responsibilities and Responses.
Yes, magic. Okay, thank you so much, Devada. So here we go. So we're at a moment that the UN Migration Agency calls a paradox not seen before in human history. And that paradox is the existence of the most rigid bordering practices in recorded human history at the same moment that there exists the highest number of forcibly displaced people. So in the last 20 years, our world population grew by 25%, and the displaced population doubled to 1.5% of the world population. So why is this happening? There's lots of push factors. This is a bit of a messy chart, but there's push factors that overlap, right? There is civil conflict, war, oppressive states, economic meltdown, civil breakdown, and those factors are very much amplified by climate change. Famine, drought, extreme weather. About 3/4 of the forcibly displaced people in the world are in states with high to extreme exposure to climate-related hazards. And in the background, we have human trafficking and criminal opportunities. People who are in these large-scale flows, they always have mixed reasons for why it is that they are displaced. But they are desperate, and the routes are becoming more dangerous as border controls become more stringent, hardening, thickening, with this hardening occurring on what is a global level. And of course, sea routes are particularly dangerous. There's one that's in the news the most, that being the Mediterranean. So here we have two charts from Frontex from 2023 and 2024, which unfortunately don't quite measure the same data points, but they're still helpful as points of comparison. So these are people who sought to enter the EU's borders without prior authorization in those 2 consecutive years. And in 2023, about 2/3 sought to enter the EU through water routes, about a similar percentage in 2024, but a reduced number overall, which is a bit closer to 2021. Those water routes, they are dictated by smugglers and traffickers. Like, no one is getting on a boat without paying a smuggler or being trafficked. And smuggling has, of course, become more profitable as options have become more complicated. Libya was the main launching point until 2023. Tunisia is now the major departure port. So these numbers that were collected by Frontex reflect the number of people who were intercepted alive. Many people don't make it. The ocean is inherently dangerous. And, and smugglers, they don't actually escort people across the water to safety. They abandon them to make their own way. Usually from just offshore. And of course, the boats are not generally seaworthy, they're overcrowded, and they're obviously not, professionally staffed. So where's the law in this? And dipping my toes in. So if those people on those boats are located and found in need of rescue, maybe because that ship is going down, there are obligations. Humanitarian imperatives are directly incorporated into the law of the sea. There are obligations on ship masters to rescue and render assistance with, a caveat of, the captain has to conclude that it is reasonable to go to the rescue. So there's some discretion even exercised here. But if rescue is attempted, then the law requires the rescuer ensure that they take those they have assisted to a place of safety, irregardless of the person's nationality or migration status. So this obligation to rescue at sea, take people to safety, actual safety, would seem to marry beautifully with the key human rights obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is to not return a person to who's facing persecution to being persecuted, and the Convention Against Torture, to not return people to a place where they will experience torture. These obligations of rescuing, of non-refoulement, they are grounded in promoting human security. But of course, there's many caveats and limitations. That Refugee Convention, of which I'm sort of a fan, only applies to those who are targeted on very narrow grounds. It is a very incomplete human rights instrument, and in my view, the law of the sea, with its open promise to rescue and deliver to safety, regardless of why someone is in need of rescue, is on its face a stronger promoter of human rights. Although once landed under international law, refugees have rights to work and reside and not be detained. Those who are not refugees, not authorized migrants, just fleeing deprivation, economic famine, they have very few rights. They face long-term detention under immigration laws and often deportation to their state of origin. Curiously to me, and I can't help how the slides show. Anyway, the law of the sea seems to have moved more effectively to address some of the protection gaps than has human rights law per se. So as noted, the SAR Convention dictates ships must take rescuees to safety. The earlier iterations in 79, there was no explicit requirement on states to actually permit disembarkation. And I speculate that is because when it was enacted, the people being rescued were largely sailors, and there wasn't any political disputes about that. But if those rescued people claim asylum, then the state where disembarkation occurs is obliged to determine their claims. Rights arise, state discretion gets fettered. And so we began to see the rise of states trying to prevent would-be asylum claimants who were rescued at sea from being able to land. And the law of the sea responded. In 2004, amendments to SAR created an obligation on state parties to coordinate and to cooperate to enable disembarkation. And we get a similar requirements in SOLAS about facilitating disembarkation if rescues in one's territorial waters. But these obligations, they only come into play if we have a rescue, with extra obligations if rescued in territorial waters. And so we see strategies of pushing back and pushing away. Don't see it, don't need to act. And it is legal to push away, right? States have the right to prevent the entry into their territorial waters, into their contiguous zones, of boats that they believe are implicated in unlawful activities, including carrying unauthorized migrants, smuggling, drugs, anything else illegal. The limitation on this is that, well, states can't do that pushback if the people on that boat manage to communicate that they are claiming refugee protection because they are fleeing persecution or torture, or if the people are clearly in actual need of rescue because that boat is unseaworthy. So they can deflect, but with a few exceptions. We see other protections being enacted in the law of the sea that once again coincide with protecting those fleeing who are vulnerable on the water. So for example, UNCLOS has provisions that all coastal state parties must have effective search and rescue, right? And it kind of looks like those fleeing by sea can expect rescue if they manage to get close enough to an asylum country. But states will interpret their obligations narrowly. So here's our little recap, pull it all together. We've got mass migration for multiple reasons. Smugglers prey on migrants, as do traffickers. States are obliged to fight smuggling under international law. States do have the right to control their own migration unless someone is a refugee. Fleeing by sea is dangerous. Rescue is mandatory. And if rescued, there is a right to non-return until a hearing is made. All of which results in costs, bypassing migration plans, keeping smugglers in business, and in some cases, human rights are in fact protected. So states pursue strategies to stop migrants from getting in the water in the first place, or to create disincentives. Canada is totally in on this. You might recall back in 2010, 2 boats from Sri Lanka made it to Canada. The passengers were all smuggled, the Sun Sea and the Ocean Lady. They were abandoned. Over 2/3 of the occupants, I think maybe just 5 weren't, determined to be refugees. But this incident alerted Canada to ocean-based mass migration coming to its doorstep. And Canada began working with coastal states from which we believed asylum seekers might seek to stay with Canada to prevent them. Canada works with these states, their military and their police, to stop people from getting out of their territorial waters. Now, the messaging is, of course, all about bringing down smuggler rings and criminal organizations, and smugglers absolutely abandon people to their death, no question of it. But we also know that the states that Canada is assisting in preventing people from leaving its territorial waters are implicated in gross human rights violations. Despite Canada's best efforts, ships still manage to leave Southeast Asia, heading for Canadian shores. This one from Myanmar with 303 Tamils happened in 2023. It was allegedly the same smuggling group who organized the Sun Sea. And when the engine broke down, the smugglers abandoned them at sea. They were eventually rescued by a Japanese freighter and then deposited in a Vietnamese refugee camp. So that's our Canadian take on these things. As to Europe, of course, there's been a lot happening this past decade. There were some very effective Italian rescue operations, which were abandoned because other EU states would not resettle the migrants or pay a fair share of costs. And there were concerns that effective rescue at sea were incentivizing ocean migrants. And so agreements were made with states like Libya to help Libya stop migrants from leaving, despite Libya being the heartland of slavery for northern Africa. Human Rights Watch tells us that when migrants are detained in Libya, they are imprisoned and they are quite often trafficked. NGOs tried to fill the protection gap, and it has been a very tense relationship. Italy became very aggressive in its efforts to stop NGO boats from docking. Sort of complying with international law, they would allow disembarkation but require the ships to travel great distances, knowing that the NGOs could not afford the time or the money, and so they were disincentivizing, undermining those practices. No one's particularly happy about the situation. The EU Parliament tried to act in 2019 with some fantastic resolutions about keeping ports open to all humanitarian vessels and developing a fair relocation plan. That was, of course, voted down, but just barely. But things haven't stopped moving. In June 2024, a new migration pact was entered into by the EU, which comes into force in 2026. Basically, every state commits to either receiving 30,000 resettled people a year or paying a certain amount of money. And so this is intended to significantly reduce the burden on states like Italy and Greece, because those who are found to be refugees will be redistributed, and if not, those states will receive compensation. And so this is hoped to result in coastal states not being as pushed to prevent would-be asylum seekers from making it to shore. There are, of course, concerns about things like, border holding centers, status determination supposed to be in 5 days, which is an implausible timeline. And they are unfortunately completely silent in this pact on reviving and funding a robust search and rescue operation in the Mediterranean. And it says nothing explicit about ending pushbacks or the obstruction of NGO boats. And meanwhile, at the same time, that pact was adopted on the heels of migration agreements being reached with Egypt and Mauritania, after ones having been entered into with Libya and Tunisia, to support them in preventing the departure of unauthorized migrants. And these countries have truly appalling human rights records. They are absolutely brutal with migrants. Italy has set up processing centers in Albania, which is not a part of the EU. And the current plan with Albania is one that the International Rescue Committee calls costly, cruel, and counterproductive, because it will push people to more dangerous routes. That's the trend. The number of people crossing the Mediterranean is falling. These agreements and these measures, they are deterrents. The routes that are being picked up on are inland, which are known, which had been avoided previously because they are so heavily preyed upon by human traffickers. There is a new graveyard opening up on the west coast of Spain, because this is becoming the new departure route. This big picture here, it's not so much about the failure of the law of the sea or human rights law. In my view, it's a lack of attention to addressing and investing in the causes of mass displacement, which takes us back to climate change. It is one very serious accelerant. A lack of human rights protections, the lack of investment in climate resilience, the exclusion of the voices of displaced populations in identifying effective responses, and the failure to address the reduction of carbon emissions. The EU states are very optimistic about the new EU compact resulting in the effective management of the migrant flow, and I think that it will, in fact, direct and move, but it's not going to stop the flow itself until we start working more on these root causes. Thank you very much. Kind of on time.
All right, thank you very much, Constance. So we have about 10 minutes, which is time for some questions. Yes, Aldo.
Very interesting presentations. I have a question for Constance.
Uh-oh. You might know the answer more than I do.
No, it's a question perhaps to seek a little more information from you in terms of what could be done with respect to the responsibilities of coastal states, as coastal states, in terms of Malta, among others, of course. Have you considered considered the potential role that the IMO's III code could play here. It's the IMO Instruments Implementation Code. This code basically is mandatory, and it concerns assessment of the implementation and enforcement of IMO instruments by the flex state, the coastal state, and the port state. And I think with respect to the coastal state, if I recall well, the expectation is to conduct an assessment of the performance of its obligations with international instruments to which it is party. So that would capture solar, for example. I'm wondering if that's something that could be useful here to hold coastal states accountable to their international obligations. Of course, there's a problem with the problem in terms of interpretation. There are those that say this concerns only IMO codes. Others say it should concern also other instruments of international law, like for instance UNCLOS. But anyway, at a minimum, it would cover solas. Would that fall perhaps within the scheme of the analysis you
So I'm going to say that because you say it might, that it probably does, right? Like this is, yeah. So this is obviously not an area that I'm really, super familiar with. But I feel like there's two states are continually trying to find ways to evade obligations, and so what I don't know with this enforcement mechanism or this monitoring mechanism is, what happens if it's determined that a state is not complying, right? Is it just, well, shame on you, or is there something more that is capable of coming from it? And I think that the reality is that states are going to keep trying to find ways to deflect, and in fact, they're going to thicken those borders more and more and more. Given the political climate. And so our emphasis really needs to turn to addressing those reasons for the displacement in the first place. And if we can turn down that tap a little bit, then I think states are going to start interpreting their obligations more generously. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this, but I will certainly look into this instrument, maybe with a little bit of your support, and try to figure out where that fits in. So thank you so much for that suggestion.
Thanks, Constance. I'm going to take one online, and then I'll come back to the room. And this comes from Chenju Chen, and this is for Patrícia. Over to you, Patrícia. So the question is this: I also enjoyed this panel a lot and have questions to the second speaker. If a mechanism is to be established, within which framework should it be founded? Within the UNCLOS or Paris Agreement framework? For instance, if it is to be within the UNCLOS framework, is it foreseeable to adopt the fourth enforcement agreement in this regard to better integrate the law of the sea regime and the climate regime?
What's his name again?
Chenju Chen.
Thank you so much for the question. I think this is the continuation of this research agenda. Right now I'm looking at mechanisms within the international climate regime that would help coordination with the obligations under UNCLOS. So those, because the climate regime, again, has a very specific now institutional structure, it's a bottom-up, it's a mix of a hybrid of obligations of conduct and obligations of result, procedural obligation. So within this framework, what types of mechanisms states can create that will not duplicate what is already happening in other regimes, including UNCLOS, that would fit well with the institutional framework, the principles, the dynamic of the international climate regime, but that would help to mainstream and to make ocean climate action more effective. including bringing more climate finance for climate ocean adaptation, accountability for what states are doing as climate mitigation, ocean mitigation, including CDR, because right now there is nothing in place, for example, under UNCLOS or UNFCCC, to address potential spillover effects. So if you're doing MCDR and scaling up in one country, it has transboundary effects. So those are the issues that I think are playing out in discussions to thicken the integration in the international climate regime.
Thanks, Patricia. There's a question up here. Loveth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think your first question was about the finance mechanism and whether it relates to renewable energy. So if you're talking about the ORRAA, it is strictly on marine resilience. That is protection against any of those weather effects against the coastal reefs, the mangroves, and if those communities have faced some form of loss of income or livelihood as a result of that weather event. As for renewable energy in the general climate finance regime, that's one of the things I looked at when I was doing my LLM thesis. And while there's no specific finance on renewable energy, funds on adaptation or mitigation is something that could be streamed down to renewable energy development, although there's a push by scholars for a more dedicated renewable energy fund, looking at how much renewable energy developments can play in mitigating climate change.
Thank you, Mohammed. It is a great question because it has played out in the literature debates. It's exactly in the question of the IMO specifically, emissions from shipping from the very beginning, the states have decided explicitly to delegate that to the IMO, so that became separate. But some of the arguments against a thicker integration is exactly this may duplicate, may defeat the purpose of obligations under UNCLOS. So that's why it's so important to be very careful about what types of mechanisms should be designed and what are the boundaries of those mechanisms to make sure that it's not duplicating or reducing this effectiveness. But I don't think that that is a great excuse. I think the idea is not to replace, but to find the gaps in to really strengthen the obligations. So if there is, of course, room for still a division of labor between those regimes, I think that we should be more clear, because right now it's just falling through the cracks. So it's just, I'm not talking about emissions from shipping, this is another debate, but obligations related to oceans and climate, there is a push. UNCLOS, UNFCCC, and sometimes it's not happening.
Thank you. So we're at time, so I guess we will finish. I think there was one other question, perhaps that could be asked directly to one of the panelists. So let's take this opportunity to say thank you to our three panelists.